So there are about 100 things that I could say about Spider-Verse that would be the same thing that everybody else is saying that I totally agree with. It's probably one of, if not the greatest Western animated film ever made, maybe the greatest superhero film ever made, one of the greatest sequels ever made. I mean, there's a bunch of hyperbolic statements I could make that I would 100% be honest in my saying. But I think the thing that has really stuck with me and hit me in a surprising way about the movie, because, we all knew it was going to be amazing. We all knew it was going to be art. The thing that's really surprised me has been how honestly it asks questions and how many rich themes are on display in the film, some of which are left unresolved to be kind of dealt with in the next movie, which I actually really liked because it's kind of caused me in turn to wrestle with those questions. And I think I was surprised by just how much those questions hit home for me in a really personal way. And it wasn't, I don't know, it was surprising because I have seen so many movies recently and movies in my life, and few of them have made me feel the way that this one did. I didn't expect that. I mean, even with the first Spider-Verse movie, I think it's great. I think it's stylistic. I think it's funny. I think it's character driven, but it doesn't make me like really emotional. And this one, it got me emotional in a way that few other superhero films have, maybe other than perhaps Guardians Volume 3. And that was surprising to me. Why did it make me emotional? I think this is a film exploring some really complex ideas of purpose and responsibility and the script that we all live by of what should happen. And it's interesting because it feels very much in dialogue with the first Spider-Verse film, which is a play on the Spider-Man mythos and kind of the common tropes of that mythos. And the first Spider-Verse film kind of subverts some of those tropes, but also falls into some of those tropes kind of very intentionally, commenting on the archetypes that form Spider-Man as a character, no matter who he is and no matter where he comes from. Maybe Spider-Man is always formed by the death of a relative or trauma or a sense of having to juggle his personal life with his superhero life. Those are core traits of Spider-Man. But I think the interesting thing that Spider-Verse asks is, why are those core traits though? And do they have to be? And it's a question that goes beyond just being about Spider-Man and really hits hard, I think, in terms of what being human is like and is about. Because there are certain things that I think that sometimes we can take for granted and things that we can take as, well, it has to be that way, that maybe don't. And that's what it really got me thinking about. Part of this is that I bring this up in videos sometimes. I don't expect everyone to agree, but I'm someone who has had a religious background and still engages with religion and faith at times, not at times, pretty frequently. I definitely see things through the lens of God and through the lens of kind of God guiding my life in some way, even if I don't always know what he's doing. And yet I think in the midst of that, there can also be, for anyone who has been raised in a religious background, Christianity or otherwise, a wrestle with, especially when you're making decisions, going, how do I do what God wants? Or what does God want for my life? What is the story God is writing for my life? And that can be sometimes very inspiring, especially when it's in the retrospect. You can kind of look back and see the way that things in your life, the pieces fell together in a really satisfying way, or in a way that you see what that thing that happened to you was for. But especially when you're looking forward into the future and trying to make decisions, it can be really difficult and actually claustrophobic, because you're like, how do I do what God wants? And that seems like this elusive idea. And I think that plays into Spider-Verse. I know that might sound a little bit unrelated, but it plays into Spider-Verse because if you haven't seen the new movie, by the way, don't watch this. This is spoilers. But the new movie really wrestles with this idea of canon and the script and kind of the archetypes of the Spider-Man lore, and even uses the term canon very directly, basically saying that there are certain events, specifically even certain tragic events, that have to happen in a Spider-Man's life for him to become Spider-Man. And even Miguel implies for the universe to not fall apart. The only way the universe can stay together is if these specific kind of comic book tropes play out in a Spider-Man's life. And the one that really directly threatens Miles in the movie is the death of his father. Because in every Spider-Man story, the police captain always dies saving a child for some reason. That's just how it always goes. And so Miguel actually is asking Miles to let his father die because that's what's supposed to happen in the canon, and the Spider-Man story is supposed to go that way. That's a really hard dilemma for Miles, obviously, and he rebels against it in the movie. But it made me think even more about what we think of as supposed to happen, and how I think of, even in decision making in my life, how I wrestle with accepting pain that maybe I shouldn't accept, or thinking things have to be a certain way that maybe they don't have to be, simply because I have to play into the story that's being told. I don't know, maybe some of this is very specific to me, but I tend to view things through the lens of story almost all the time. I kind of view my life as a story, especially in the retrospect. Like I said, there's always that sense of like, whoa, I see the story that maybe God or some divine thing was telling in my life. But even looking forward, there can also be this sense of like, oh, I see what's going on. Like, I see how this thing is leading to this thing. And wouldn't it be really poetic if this thing happened? You know, maybe part of that is being a filmmaker. Like, my wife and I have made some films about our life. And so I think I'm bound to kind of see things through that lens, and maybe even think, what if we made a film about this season of our life? How would it look like? What would be the resolution of that film? It's maybe I don't know. I was about to say it was a toxic trait of mine. Maybe there's a good side of it, but I think it can be a toxic trait that I tend to want things to always happen in some kind of 3-act structure, satisfying arc, you know, and when it doesn't, maybe I try to kind of live into that arc, or kind of live into like, well, it has to be this way, so I have to do it like this. Spider-Verse got me thinking about even the character of Peter Parker in other Spider-Man iterations and incarnations, the way that, like in No Way Home, the ending of No Way Home which is the most recent Tom Holland Spider-Man movie, Tom Holland Spider-Man accepts that everyone's going to have to forget who Peter Parker is. He accepts that Aunt May dies, and then in kind of a cherry on top of tragedy, as everyone has forgotten who Peter Parker is, he decides not to go and tell MJ, his girlfriend, who he is, even though before her memory was wiped, she asked him to come and find her and tell her who he is, and he decides not to. He decides to spare her. And I think that's interesting because it's kind of in direct contrast to the way that this movie wrestles with the canon of Spider-Man, which is basically saying like if the ending of No Way Home is Tom Holland, Peter Parker kind of going, I've accepted that the fate of Spider-Man is to suffer, and the fate of Spider-Man is that life is always going to be isolated and tragic and sad, and I'm just going to embrace that and not tell her, you know, to spare her, even though she wanted me to tell her and understood the risks. I think this movie is saying, hey, isn't that a little bit messed up? Like that Spider-Man has to suffer and has to be isolated. Does he, though? And should that be the canon? You know, and Miles is specifically asking that. I think he even uses the phrase, do you know how messed up that sounds? You know, it's interesting even in direct contrast to the first Spider-Verse movie and to No Way Home, where like in the first Spider-Verse movie, the common tropes in the Spider-Man canon were used as almost a comfort, like the fact that all of the other Spider people had lost Uncle Ben helped Miles to come to terms with the fact that he had just lost his Uncle Aaron, because it's like, you know, this is what happens to all Spider people. And so there's sort of a sense of like shared pain, shared trauma. Oh, you too, kind of to that. And I think No Way Home, you know, with Andrew Garfield and Tobey Maguire and Tom Holland does the same thing. It kind of uses that common script as comfort, because it's like, well, it's happened to all of us, and so it's okay, you know. And I don't think there's anything wrong with that. I think that's interesting and maybe even beautiful, this sort of shared pain allowing you to accept the death and tragedy that has befell you. But I think it's so interesting that the new Spider-Verse asks, but does it have to, though? One of the things that I noticed on one of the second watches of the movie was when Miles is in his, like, I guess it's an admissions counselor meeting, trying to figure out, you know, what college he wants to go to. He wants to go to Princeton. The lady says to him, you know, she's trying to help him form his story, the story that he's going to tell colleges of why he should go to Princeton. And he finally says kind of his big like theme statement of why he wants to go. And she goes, that's your story. Now stick to the script. And I'm like, man, what a good like tie into the whole theme of the movie that people are constantly asking Miles to stick to the script. And yet, I think there's something really beautiful. And this is where some people have said that Spider-Verse, this Spider-Verse, Across the Spider-Verse, feels like a part one that's unresolved. And I disagree with that. I understand why they've said that, but I actually think that it tells a really compelling, beginning, middle, end story. It still leaves questions. It still leaves some plot threads unresolved, obviously. But I do think that it ends in a way that's really beautiful because it interrogates that idea very directly by showing us what happens when you break the script, what happens when you break the canon. And sometimes it's beautiful, And so at the beginning of the movie, Gwen reveals herself to her father, reveals that she is Spider-Woman, and kind of, in a sense, breaks the canon in that way. Spider people don't usually reveal themselves to their parents. Usually their parents die. Her dad is supposed to die. He's the police captain. And so she's kind of wrestling with that throughout the movie, realizing that he's going to have to die because this is how the archetype goes. This is how the canon goes. She reveals herself to her dad, and it doesn't go well. He still wants to arrest her. And then she says, I can't fix this. I don't think I can fix this. And that's when Miguel says, join the club, and kind of pulls her into the ranks of the multiversal spider team. And I thought that was interesting because it's almost like this moment of she's broken the canon in some way, and yet we know that would be messy for her to resolve. We know that that's going to be messy. And so instead of trying to resolve it, she says, I don't think I can fix this. And she leaves. And she she leaves her universe to avoid resolving this familial conflict, and then urges Miles not to tell his parents either, because that would she sees how maybe that would make his life fall apart too. And yet, throughout the movie, we actually then start to see the ways that breaking the script, breaking the canon, leads to even more beautiful things happening, despite the fact that it wasn't how it was supposed to go. Like, for instance, the police inspector in the India Mumbattan universe was supposed to die, and Miles helps to save him. And you've got that same classic dilemma of, the Indian Spider-Man, Pav, is trying to save the bus that has his girlfriend in it, and he wants to save the police captain at the same time. And there's that classic Spider-Man dilemma of, I can do both. I want to do both. I want to be able to save this person and this person. And that's kind of a classic Spider-Man trope of Spider-Man always wants to be able to save both people, but he can't, because you can't be everywhere all at once. And he's not limitless. He is limited. And yet I think that trope also comes with an assumption that many Spider-Man movies have. And this is not me critiquing Spider-Man movies, but I do think it's an interesting unpacking of this idea that, Spider-Man can't do both because he's a lone hero. He's a lone ranger. He has to be isolated, and he can't tell anyone about his identity or receive help in that way. And so it's true. If Pav wanted to save his girlfriend in the bus and the police inspector, he can't do both. And that's a hard truth that many Spider-Mans in the past kind of stories have had to wrestle with. And yet, through the presence of Miles and through this teamwork and through a Spider-Man coming from a different world, they actually are able to do both. And so I think it directly kind of confronts even, what Gwen says at the start of the movie about, she says, I always wanted to be in a band, but, this job is a solo act, right? And the movie ends with her saying, I always wanted to start a band, and I finally did. And so you end with a sense that maybe sometimes the Spider-Man canon is this sense of self-inflicted, I have to be a loner, I have to be solo, I have to do this on my own. And maybe when you open yourself up to other people helping you, you don't have to make that choice between the police inspector and the girlfriend. Maybe you can do both, but it requires allowing other people to come into that. And maybe that does break the script, but maybe it leads to something more beautiful, as we see when the police inspector and the girlfriend are both safe, and Pav thanks him so warmly. And it's just a beautiful moment of wow, we saw the death that was about to happen, and then it didn't happen. And it's actually, as much as they are trying to tell us that the canon is broken and this is a bad thing, you see this beautiful thing that Miles has caused by inserting himself into the situation and not just accepting that, oh, that's how it's supposed to go. Even more so than that, I think the most beautiful conclusion is, and this is the scene that actually made me cry the first time, is when Gwen comes back to her world and finally does confront her dad and have a conversation with him. And ultimately it leads to reconcile. And her dad decides, now finding out that his daughter is Spider-Woman, he's come to terms with this, he's wrestled with it, and through her little speech he decides he's going to step down as the police captain. And I love that moment because there's so much going on beneath the surface. It's, on the one hand, it's just a beautiful healing of the relationship between a father and daughter. But on the other hand, it's also, he decides to step down from being the police captain. And so we see on Gwen's face, she knows now this means maybe he's not going to die anymore. Maybe she has, by being vulnerable with him, revealing herself to him, even though it was messy, and then having this messy conversation and confronting each other directly instead of running away and saying, I can't fix this, she actually has saved his life. She's broken the canon, but she has saved his life and completely healed their relationship. And I just think that's like one of the most beautiful subversions of this idea that I've seen. And I think it's a lovely thing. So it definitely got me thinking about sometimes the ways in which I tell myself, well, you can't have that desire because that would break the script. That would break the canon. That can't be, or you shouldn't bring up that messy thing, or you shouldn't bring up that hard thing. You should press down that feeling. You should keep that thing to yourself. You should try to deal with that thing on your own, because that would break the script that you're supposed to be living. And like I said, especially having kind of made movies about my life with my wife and stuff, and there's sort of a picturesque nature to that. Sometimes it's like, I don't want to ruin that picturesque, image. Like, we have such a good story. I don't want to break the story, and again, from that faith angle, I think as well, there can be a sense of wanting to play into like, God, how can I live out the story that you want me to live? How can I do what you would want me to do? How can I embody the canon that you want to tell? And I think sometimes we can see that story, that divine tapestry that he's weaving after the fact. I think especially in retrospect, we can see it sometimes, but often we can't see it looking forward, and we just have to live our lives and try our best and not do things just because they're supposed to happen, especially if it's self-inflicted pain, self-inflicted isolation, self-inflicted tragedy, like saying, well, I have to be alone. I have to endure this without anyone helping me, because that's how the story is supposed to go, and that's what a good story looks like. I think so often, if you've had any experience with Christianity, there can be a sense in Christian life that the point of being a Christian, the very nature of being a Christian, of following God, whatever that means, is to give up yourself, is to give up your desires, is to forfeit any sense of self, and to serve others above all else and push down anything that you might want or need. And it's interesting how Spider-Man even plays into that a little bit, because I think it's often the case in Spider-Man movies that, it's made out that that's what it is to be Spider-Man as well. What it is to be Spider-Man is to give up what you want and be what other people need you to be, embrace that responsibility that you've been given, and give up the things that you want or need, but also, endure tragedy and endure isolation, because that's the very nature of being a hero, right? And there's some truth to that. Being a hero is really hard, and I love the way that like the Raimi Spider-Man movies wrestle with that. But this also got me thinking about, even specifically, like there have been times in my life where I've used that quote from Spider-Man 2, where Tobey Maguire Spider-Man says, sometimes we have to give up the things that we want most, and we have to be steady. That quote about how you have to give up the things that you want in order to be a hero and in order to take responsibility. I've used that quote in a lot of my life, just in the back of my head. Sometimes that will play and echo in my brain as a way of actually avoiding messiness and avoiding bringing up anything difficult and avoiding being a problem. Because I'm like, well, to be a Christian or to be a hero is to give up the thing that you want most. And that quote from Peter just plays in my head. And there's a beauty to that, and there's a selflessness to that, but I think it can also become an idol, and it can turn into something that is not healthy and turn into something that is not good. And what I do believe deep down, even beyond those kind of subconscious reactions that I have, is that our desires are also put inside of us by something higher than us, and they can be good desires, and they can be beautiful, and sometimes we have to be willing to be a problem, because that's what leads us into a further reality and a deeper reality. And sometimes we have to take a step of faith, not necessarily a step of faith in the religious sense, but a step of faith of like, I trust that this is going to work out, even though it seems like I'm just getting into further messiness. I think about something I loved is how this movie pays off the arc of Peter B. Parker in the first Spider-Verse movie, who is very much embodying in that first Spider-Verse movie that like Spider-Man who has to suffer. Spider-Man always has to suffer, and he's divorced from Mary Jane, he's washed up, his life is terrible, and he's like, I just have to keep suffering, you know, and that's what it is to be Spider-Man, you know, and he's cynical and all this kind of stuff. And yet through his interaction with Miles kind of shows him that another way is possible, shows him what maybe having kids would be like. And it allows him to go back to his timeline and actually kind of break the canon by breaking the cycle of self-inflicted, you know, tragedy and misery and angst, and get back together with Mary Jane and have a beautiful daughter that now he's so happy to have. And that's only because Miles was willing to show him the ways in which he doesn't have to stick to the script. And maybe his life of misery had become an idol for him and a sense of identity that was not actually who he was supposed to be. I don't know how much this is just specific to my experience, and I don't know how much anyone else will resonate with this. And I don't even know if I've articulated it very well myself, but it's definitely hit me hard, and I'm still trying to figure out what to do with it and how that affects my life in some way. But I think it really has hit me strong. And it even ties in with, I've been wanting to write something for a while on my Substack about the Guardians of the Galaxy 3, which is wonderful, beautiful, one of the best trilogy enders of all time, I think. It's such a lovely movie, but one of the things that stuck out to me about that film specifically was the line that Lila says to Rocket about, you know, Rocket says, I was just an experiment in a lab. There was no purpose, no point to my life. You know, I was just made to be thrown away. And she says, there are the hands that make us, and then there are the hands that guide the hands. And that has really stuck with me as well, as this idea of sometimes, you know, the terrible things that happen to us or the messy things that happen to us can seem inexplicable in the time. And sometimes there are bad people who do bad things to us. But yet in the midst of that, some of those things are being redeemed, and some of those things are, you know, goodness is being brought out of that. And even though it's true that Rocket was made as an experiment to be thrown away, we're glad that he exists, you know, and I guess that connects to me because if you compare that to like the High Evolutionary, the villain in Guardians Volume 3, he's someone who, he doesn't believe in the hands that guide the hands. He says, there is no God, that's why I had to step in, which is one of the most raw villain lines I've ever heard. But it is that sense of, even with him, he's kind of doing what I've done in my life, which is trying to create that divine story for himself, trying to be like, this is what God would want, right? Even though God doesn't exist, I'm doing what God would want, right? Trying to play God, trying to construct that perfect world, that perfect story, that perfect canon, which is what I think the High Evolutionary is trying to do. He's trying to tell a story that's satisfying to him, to his sensibilities, and to what he thinks it should look like, what things should be. And Rocket says, you know, you didn't want things to be perfect. You just hated things the way they are. And I think that's I don't know, it shows me how sometimes the things that we think, like the things we can conceive of, like, this is the story that should be told. This is the way the story has to be. And I want the story to be this way. Those stories that we try to live into without even consulting God or consulting anyone, like, they're so much less good than the things that ultimately come out of living into the messiness, telling our dad that we're Spider-Man, you know, like, it's hard and it's messy. And if we try to skip that to just live the perfect script and live the perfect story, create the perfect planet or the perfect society, we miss the hands that guide the hands that maybe are present even as we're making our own decisions. And even as we're trying to avoid pain, you know, maybe we don't have to just accept all the pain that we have. And maybe we do have to accept some pain other times. But I think trying to parse out that, like, what's meant to be and what's not meant to be, and what the story is supposed to be and not supposed to be in the moment, is impossible and ultimately hinders you from living into the moment that might ultimately lead you to reconcile with your dad, or, you know, find purpose, or save someone who wouldn't have been saved because you worked with someone else and invited someone else into your story instead of isolating yourself, because that's what has to happen. So I don't know. I don't know if any of this resonates with other people. This movie really moved me. And it's a masterpiece on so many other arenas. I just bought the Hobie action figure because, man, what a guy. What a great guy. I don't believe in comedy. Just kidding. Like, all the stuff. I hate the AM. I hate the PM. I hate labels. It's so good. It's so funny. It's just I've seen it 3 times now in Dolby, and I've got to see it again soon because there's nothing like it. Like, it's a beautiful movie. It's a beautiful work of art. But I think the thing that astounded me the most was the way that it genuinely surprised me by the end. It genuinely left me with questions, and it genuinely left me with a story that moved me and that was so character focused. And I am interested to see how they resolve this stuff in the 3rd movie, you know, because there is an element of, like, now there's a world that doesn't have Spider-Man because Miles is Spider-Man, and we see some darkness in Miles, even in him kind of choosing his own fate and choosing not to live into the script. There's a sense of, like, well, but aren't you like ignoring that maybe there's something, like, is that going to be destructive ultimately, or is Miguel wrong? You know, I think that's interesting, and I'm really interested to see how they resolve it and how Miles wrestles with that in the 3rd movie. But that's the way that it hit me. I thank you so much for watching this video. If you appreciated it, maybe comment your favorite spider person from the movie in the comments below, and otherwise just tell me your thoughts on this. Do you resonate with this experience? Do you resonate with any of the thoughts that I shared here? I'd love to hear about it, and I'm just thankful that you joined me for this video. I'd like to do more things like this soon, just kind of turning on the camera, talking about something, not many cuts, that sort of thing. It'd be fun. But thanks for joining me. If you'd like to check out my Patreon, that's in the link below, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.